today we are going to look at how we can solve all quadratics together. So if we're just given a quadratic, how can we decide what method we want to use to solve it and get to the answer? The key here today is that there isn't a correct option to pick sometimes. There's often choices that we can pick in between, and so some of this will come down to your individual decision about what you prefer as an option for you. What I did put together is a flow chart that you can sort of use to guide yourself through some questions that might help you decide what option is a good option to pick, but that doesn't mean it's the only option that you can pick. So when we're using this flow chart, we always want to start up here with this bold box in the top left-hand corner of it. So we're going to use this flow chart as we look at some of these problems over here. Okay, so this first problem that we're looking at says x squared plus 5x equals 0. Okay, so when we look at this, the first question says, does the problem have a binomial squared or just x squared? Okay, so this is asking, does it have a binomial squared? A binomial squared, remember, is something that's binomial, two terms, squared, or just an x squared. Okay, so an x squared with no x to the first power. Now, if we look at this example, x squared plus 5x is not a binomial squared, and we do have something with x to the first power, so no, we're not in that situation. Okay, is it a binomial or a trinomial? Okay, so that means we're going to count the number of terms. 0 doesn't count as a term, so we have 1, 2 terms. Okay, so the key when we're looking at this one here is that 0 doesn't count as a term. Any other one does, but 0 doesn't count. Okay, so this is a binomial. So we're going to factor out a GCF and then set each factor equal to 0. Again, it's not the only way that we could do this, but this is going to be a quick way to do it. So if we look at x squared plus 5x, that has a GCF of x, so we can pull that x out, and this will factor into x times x plus 5. Right, and then we know once we're here, we can set each of these factors equal to 0. So I can set x equal to 0, and I can set x plus 5 equal to 0. And then need to solve these both individually. So x equals 0 is already solved. X plus 5, I'm going to do some work to solve. And so my two answers will be x equals 0 and x equals negative 5. Okay, now I'm going to look at my next example. X squared minus 6x equals 4. So again, we're starting at the top of the list. Does the problem have a binomial squared? No. Does it have just an x squared with no x to the first? No, we have that 6x, so no. Is it a binomial or a trinomial? So again, it's not set equal to 0, but we can still count 1, 2, 3 terms. So this is a trinomial. Does A equal 1? Yes, A does equal 1, right? If we look in this x squared, there's a 1 in front of it, so A does equal 1. Can we factor it as a trinomial? Now, you might say to that, I hate factoring, and so it doesn't matter if I can or can't. I'm not capable of factoring it as a trinomial, and so maybe you answer it as a no, right? That could be a preference to you. Someone else might say, well, I don't know, let me think about subtracting that 4 over and setting it equal to 0. Well, no, I can't think of factors that add up to 6, right? So could be a preference in there, but this is a no, we can't factor it as a trinomial. Is B even? Yes, right, our B value is even, it is. So this is telling us that it's suggesting us to solve by completing the square. So solving by completing the square is that option where we find B, take half, and then square it whole, right, that whole process. Okay, so if we look at this, we say, okay, we're going to solve by completing the square. So we find B, which is negative 6. We take half, which is negative 3. We square it, which is 9. So we're going to add that 9 to each side. Okay, on the right-hand side, this gives us a 13. We're going to factor our left-hand side, which goes into that middle number, so x minus 3 squared. If you're not sure these steps and you're going, oh my gosh, what's happening? You might want to go back and watch the video on how we solve by completing the square. Then we're going to square root each side. Right, we would check to see if we can simplify the square root of 13, but we can't. And so we'll have x equals 3 plus or minus the square root of 13. So now let's look at our next one. X squared plus 6x plus 8. Okay, if we start at that top of the flow chart, does the problem have a binomial squared or just an x squared? Nope, it's neither of those, right? We have an x to the first, so that's a no. Is it a binomial or a trinomial? 1, 2, 3, it has 3 terms, so it's a trinomial. Does a equal 1? Yes. So then we're going to see if we can factor this as a trinomial. So can we think of factors of 8 that will add up to 6? We can, right? 2 and 4. So this is suggesting we solve it by factoring. Remember, when we solve it by factoring, we want to make sure that it's set equal to 0. Okay, so we're going to make sure that we get this set equal to 0, which it is. So 1 times 8 is 8. So we're going to take multiples of 8. 1 and 8, 2 and 4, 3 and nothing. Right, our set that works is 2 and 4. So we'll say an x plus 2 and an x plus 4. And we can then set both of those equal to 0. So solve these. And so our answers will be -2 and -4. If we look at our next one, does it have a binomial squared or just an x squared? No. Is it a binomial or a trinomial? 1, 2, 3, trinomial. Does a equal 1? No. So it's suggesting that we use the quadratic formula, right? Our quadratic formula says x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Right? We also have to remember that when we're using the quadratic formula, it has to be set equal to 0. So if we're looking at this one right here and we want to use the quadratic formula, right, we need it to be set equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract that 14 over. And then I'm going to start plugging into my quadratic formula. So -2, 2 squared, minus 4 times 3 times -14. Again, if you're not sure what's happening with how to use the quadratic formula, you might want to go back and watch that video that's over how to solve with quadratic formula first. Okay, so we're going to simplify underneath the square root. So I'm just doing those numbers underneath the square root, which gives us a 172. We're going to want to make sure we get this 172 simplified. So I have -2 plus or minus 2 square root 43 all over 6. We're going to do our outside numbers and reduce those. Those can each be reduced by 2, so -1 plus or minus the square root of 43 all over 3. Okay, if we look at option 5, does it have a binomial squared or just an x squared? And this one does just have an x squared. So this one tells us we can solve by taking a square root. So all we need to do is just move away from that variable to get that x by itself, right? So I'm undoing subtracting with addition. And I'm going to undo my exponent of 2 by square rooting. And so we'll get x equals plus or minus 3. Okay, finally in our last one, right? Does it have a binomial squared or just an x squared? It has neither of those. It is a trinomial. A does equal 1. Factoring factors of -8, that will add up to 4. We can't think of any. So then this starts to come down to, well, it says that b is even, that we could use completing the square. But again, I want to talk about the big piece of choice here. You might go, okay, well, I could add that 8 over and do completing the square. But you also might go, well, it's already set equal to 0, so maybe I just want to use the quadratic formula. This is really where it comes down to your personal preference. So whatever choice you want to pick, that choice is up to you. Okay, I personally prefer completing the square. So that's the method I'm going to pick. But if you prefer quadratic formula, you might want to do this with the quadratic formula and just make sure that your answer is the same as mine. So I'm going to add 4 to each side. square root. So I'm going to simplify the square to 12. I'm going to subtract that 2 over. And if you use the quadratic formula, as long as you reduced it completely, you should get the exact same answer as me, and you should have -2 plus or minus 2 square root 3.